Welcome to the Culture Design Show, where we feature conversations with leaders and thinkers who are passionate about culture and design. Now, let's get started with the show.
Steve Chaparro here. I am the host of the Culture Design Show, a podcast where I feature leaders and thinkers at some of the top creative firms in the world, including architecture, design, technology, and marketing. But what's the one thing they have in common? They all believe in the power of culture and design. This podcast is brought to you by Culture Design Studio. We help people and culture leaders who feel constrained in their ability to engage their employees to become champions for their people. Through a series of facilitated workshops, we provide a practical and collaborative process to transform the culture within their creative organization. We've worked with organizations like Duarte Design, Design Thinkers Group, Red Bull, USAID, Bacardi, and the Office of Civic Innovation. So if you're looking for more than just a consultant, but someone who can facilitate your organization through a structured conversation to transform your culture, reach out to us. To learn more, go to culturedesignstudio.com. Daniel Stillman is a conversation designer and the podcast host. I'll redo that. Daniel Stillman is a conversation designer and podcast host at The Conversation Factory. Drawing on more than a decade in the product design and innovation world, he helps leaders design and facilitate important conversations, large and small, in order to improve organizational collaboration and ultimately innovation. Daniel is also the author of Good Talk, a book which describes how to design conversations that matter. Daniel, welcome to the Culture Design Show.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
It's good to have you on. I've heard you so many times on your own podcast, so it's great to be across the table virtually from you. So it's been a pleasure.
I've heard people say it's that like the people who've met me first through the podcast are like, I can't believe you're in stereo and your voice is coming out of your mouth. Yeah. And it's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's because I'm just a disembodied voice to so many people.
Yes, to some people, it's just a voice, and they match a face to a voice now. So I want to go way back, Daniel. So I want to go back to your childhood. Where are you from, and what was growing up? What did that look like?
Wow, that is way back because I'm getting older all the time. I was born in a small island off the coast of North America. It's only 13 miles by 6 miles. You may have heard of it. It's called Manhattan.
Ah, yes.
It's tiny little slip of land.
Tiny.
It's tiny. It's funny. So I've been to lots of cities. I grew up in New York, as I said. And when you go to a place like Tokyo, they're like, oh my God, you're from New York. I'm like, are you kidding me? Tokyo's insane. And it just keeps going and going. You're on a rooftop and you see little dots of light going in infinity. New York is obviously a huge place, but I grew up in a really small town part of it. I grew up in the Upper West Side, which when I was a little kid was kind of a black, white, brown neighborhood. I grew up with really loud Hispanic music blaring from the street, even though you're on the 17th floor, it's still pretty loud. And I remember during the crack epidemic in the 80s, I thought crack was called crack because it filled the cracks of the sidewalks. And, around the corner from me was, a single room occupancy hotel. And on the other corner around the street from me were $1 million brownstones and high rises. So it's definitely, New York is a strange place. But my mom is from Queens. My dad's from Brooklyn. And I like to joke that they emigrated to Manhattan to give me a better life. It's funny, like I'm a third generation immigrant, but I think I still feel like an immigrant. You talk about culture and being like a third culture kid. New York is really a soup of cultures. When people say like, what do you love about New York? I love that New York's like the world. Falafel and dim sum and, just eat the world in New York. And we're just all pushed up together. So that's what New York is to me. That's what it was like growing up.
When I've ever gone to New York, it's just amazing. I've taken my family. I've got 2 kids, and the languages that we hear being spoken on the streets are just amazing. That's just such a cosmopolitan experience.
Yes.
That I have not necessarily experienced, say, where I'm from in LA. I grew up in Michigan, but I'm fifth generation Hispanic from, family coming from Mexico.
You're more American than I am, like in lots of layers.
Yeah.
It's like that thing, make America Mexico again.
But even for some of my, Hispanic friends who are literally like first generation, they assume certain things about my own experience when I'm fifth generation, and like, oh, that's the reason why you're not 100% fluent in Spanish. But yeah, to that experience of New York, such a really, this mosaic of experiences. What did you want to do when you were growing up?
Oh man.
Like, what was the career that you thought you would have?
I think I don't know, honestly. Oh wait, no. I think the first thing I ever wanted to be was a claymation director. I don't know if you remember the California Raisins. Yeah. You might be a similar age to me. Maybe you're a little younger. But I remember when the California Raisins came out, and I was like, I loved clay. I loved sculpting in clay. I made little characters for myself to play with because clay was, I think, cheaper than all the figures I wanted. My parents got me a lot of He-Man, but like Voltron was way too expensive for my middle class family. So like I made my own Voltron with clay. It didn't work as well because the parts stick to each other. But my parents did buy me a Super 8 camera, and I did stop motion animation films when I was like in like 4th and 5th grade, and that was like I really loved this idea of making figurines move and talk and engage. That was the first thing I ever wanted to do.
Yeah, and when you were in high school, what were you prepping yourself for, as you were thinking about college?
My parents were very, very high-minded people. So I think I wound up doing physics. I sort of thought I would go study science because that's what Jewish kids do when you're smart. It's like doctor, lawyer, scientist. And to me, physics was my parents were really into philosophy and Eastern philosophy and seeking the truth and realizing themselves. They were into that sort of stuff. And for me, physics was a way of understanding the world in as deep a way as possible. When I went to college I got a master's in physics. And there's this classic snarky physicist's quote from, I'm blanking out on who said it. I can visualize the experiment that he performed, which is the gold foil experiment that showed that atoms had very, very small, massive, dense nuclei. When you shoot basically alpha particles, that some of them bounce off, which was like Rutherford. Thank you for sparking my memory. Rutherford said, in science, there's only physics. All the rest is stamp collecting. And so this idea that underneath biology, underneath chemistry, underneath earth science, all of which I loved. I love the sciences. Underneath all of it was physics, understanding why something really is happening. And that perspective, I think, really has infected still to this day what I do with in the design work, because it's like wanting to know why something is happening, not just doing it, and not just fixing something and it's great that the fix works. It's like, well, why did the fix work? What's going on underneath it? So that's that real hunger for why is what the physics was all about.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting because, obviously that would probably be one of the questions I even had listed is like, how does a physics major end up designing conversations? But I think that gives me a perspective.
I can also draw the arc for you, which is that when I got out of school, it's basically a useless degree. You might as well have a degree in poetry because you can't just get a job. There's have to get a PhD.
Is it a pathway through academia?
Yeah, it's academia. You get a PhD. I did research and I was like, ugh. But I loved education. I loved teaching. I always tutored kids. I tutored people who were going through the courses that I was going through at the same time. Which was like eye-opening to like learn and teach at the same time. And I think that's really how I learned, was through teaching. And so for when I got out of school, I thought to myself, well, maybe I can do science exhibit design. You think about like the figurine and the making things, making dioramas is how I always got extra credit in grade school. You could like whatever book you were reading, you could just make a diorama and you'd get extra credit. It was super fun. So I did that tons of diorama making. So I never really thought about the connection between my claymation addiction and, okay, science exhibit design. What if we could design a space where people enter into it and they can automatically learn about whatever it is they need to learn about, right? I loved the Museum of Natural History as a kid. I actually managed to work there. I managed a research lab for several years. There's a secret research lab on the roof of the Museum of Natural History. The elevator to my office was big enough to put a stegosaurus in. It was a wonderful, wonderful job. Paid me literally almost nothing. There was no career path, but I got closer to seeing what exhibit designers did. And then I wound up going to design school at Pratt because somebody said, oh, well, if you want to do exhibit design, Pratt has a program in industrial design, but you'll learn how to be a designer because you're not. And yeah, you're not a designer. And there's a studio in exhibit design. And I did that. And I was like, whew, boy, that's a tough industry. Political, slow moving. If there's any exhibit designers out there, I'm sorry, prove me wrong, but it's hard. And nobody taught me about stakeholder management and human-centered design is what I learned about in school. Unintentionally, they didn't call it that. Design thinking was really just on the fringes in 05, 06 in the world. But design was shifting from just making things to making experiences, but we didn't call it that yet. And so when I got out of design school, I got a job as a user researcher and strategist because that's what I knew how to do. I knew how to talk. I knew how to talk to people and talk to clients. And this question of how do we design the future of blank for our client, right? And what's ultimately frustrating about that process is you can talk to them until they're blue in the face about what you're learning in the streets and in the world. And even if you take them along with you on the ride and try to tell them the stories, they come on the interviews with you, whatever you wind up making kind of tends to dissolve into the bowels of the organization, kind of like Han Solo would have in the pit of the Sarlacc, were it not for a certain young Jedi rescuing him.
Yes, I think I know his name. I love hearing people's journeys of how, it's almost like you just pull a thread and you just see what comes from that pulling of the thread. And there is a thread through everything you've described. And I've even seen a thread between people that I've talked to that are essentially, for lack of a better term, master facilitators. And that comes from there is this unique, the shared experience of having the heart of a teacher, of wanting to not just be satisfied with just conveying information, but that there is some sort of transformation in that person. And to your point of physics, getting to the heart of the matter, like to the why of it. What are some of your thoughts about that?
About which part of it?
Anything that stood out to you?
Well, so it's interesting that you use the word thread. I'm actually wondering, what made you use that word thread?
I think because when I think of my own journey, I think of I have had people question certain career changes or changes that I've made. So my undergrad is in architecture. I started in the industry of architecture, but then I went to real estate development, and then I became a financial advisor. And then I went back to real estate, and then back to architecture, now into the world of innovation. But people have asked me, how in the world did you make those changes? And there is a thread through everything. And I'm even at the age of 45, I'm learning to discover what that thread is. And it's been a path of discovery for myself, of understanding what is similar in all those things that I pursued.
Yes. So the word threading is so fascinating to me for so many reasons. So the first reason is I highly recommend, if anybody's listening to this, maybe the best book about experience design was not written by a quote unquote experience designer. It was written by a restaurateur, and it's called Setting the Table, and it's by Danny Meyer, who, 11 Madison Park, Union Square Cafe, and the Shake Shack, which we all know and love. And Danny Meyer's book, and if he's listening, I'd love to have you on my show. I'm sure you would too. He talks about his process of creating a new experience, i.e. a restaurant. And the first stage is collecting dots. And the second stage is connecting dots. And you just look at what design thinking is, and I know you consult on design thinking, as do I. And that's pretty much what we advise our clients is just go out, go broad, go wide, collect dots. And this idea of being able to connect dots is the art of creating a thread. We build the thread. We tell stories. We tell narratives. And what I've learned for myself is my mother, who will also listen to this podcast, she listens to all of my episodes. It's amazing.
The greatest fans ever.
Well, it's not just that. The fact is, people are like, oh, my mother, like I have to explain what I do to my mother. I'm like, my mother's smart and she gets it because she gets me and she loves me. My mother has a deference in what I would call her conversation operating system that is very high when it comes to narrative threading. Mm-hmm. Everything is a story, yes. Right? But a very coherent story. Whereas my friend Darcy, who I also talk about in my book, has a high propensity for like multi-narrative threading. When you have a conversation with him, it goes everywhere and he always brings it back. Mm-hmm. And that bothers some people. Some people want to stay on one thread and mono-threading. And some people are multi-threaders. Really good friends, when they have a conversation, go like 6-10 threads. They're like talking about their feelings and the movies they're going to see next week and what they had for dinner yesterday, back and forth, back and forth. All the conversations are happening all at the same time. What's really interesting about the word threading to me is that you're absolutely right. It is 100% one of the most important skills a facilitator can have is the ability to paint a picture for people about what we're going to do and why it matters, to tell that story and to collect, to make all the dots fit together. It's one of the reasons why in the book that I wrote, I made actually even before I wrote the book, I was studying in my podcast this idea of what does it mean to design a conversation. And you know as well as I do, with design, you're designing a thing. Whatever it is, a service or an experience eventually comes down to there's a touch point. Maybe I'm just saying this because I'm an industrial designer. I'm holding my water bottle right now, which makes that sound. When you design a thing in industrial design, when you design a thing, if you want to make it better, I can tell you, okay, fix that curve or make it lighter. It doesn't fit my hand well. This catches here. I'd like to loosen that up. And so there's physicality to the materials of design are very clear. With UX design and service design and experience design, it becomes so much more ephemeral. And so the question is, if customer experience is the core of everything that most companies do, what are you designing when you're designing experiences? And that's why Danny Meyer's book is so interesting, because the idea of setting the table is so core. You can't force somebody to have a good meal. You can only set the table. Somebody can come to 11 Madison Park, one of the best restaurants in the world, and have a bad date because of who they're with, or they could be worried about their job, or their parents could have just passed away. They could be having the best meal in the world, and it doesn't matter. They'll have a bad night. Danny Meyer cannot control that. And banks and legal firms and insurance companies can design experiences. They can shape them, but you can't guarantee all the time. And so for me, the question is, if we are designing these experiences, what are the elements of these experiences? And I had a woman from Google on my podcast several years ago who was from the conversation design group at Google. And what they were doing was trying to model human conversation so that obviously they could shape it better. And Google actually had a really interesting perspective on conversation design. And there turned out there's this whole world of theory, of conversation theory, which I knew nothing about. And they talk about threading, the thread of a conversation, a single conversation. But yet no one could really define it very well for me. But you and I both know that good conversational threading is a sense of coherence. And when you're like, hey, what are we talking about here? I'm sorry, we're jumping all over the place. Like, what's this? What are we even talking about here? And we've all had that experience inside of a meeting. We've all had that experience at a date, right? If you can remember back that far. I can remember back that far. And you're like, what are we here talking about? Like, what is going on? I'd like to write a book called What the Fuck Are We Talking About? If I can curse on this podcast, I apologize. But so that's why threading is interesting to me. And you can see I actually have a multi-threaded, those like 3 stories there. But threading is this really interesting thing. And it's at the core of not just what we do as facilitators, but it's a human thing, right? It's important to remember that it's a human thing. When somebody's like, oh, I'm not a good facilitator, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, you do it every day.
Yeah. And I do think it's a muscle, and I do think that there are certain skills, like, in certain design industries or, that I've worked at, or designers, I believe that the skill of facilitation is so necessary, because I've been in say a discovery session where a designer is just talking and they're connecting things in their head and they're verbalizing things, but they have no clue about how the room is
empathy.
Yeah, that empathy, that social
empathy
awareness
starts at home.
My goodness, some people absolutely lack that ability to read the room and then to be able to respond to it. But I think to your point of being able to articulate some of those things that the room is saying, they may not be saying it in a very coherent or in a shared manner, but they're being able to pick out, okay, that person is saying this, this person is saying that, all these people are saying certain things, the thread that is starting to emerge. And I think that's what I love about sort of design thinking, is this idea is that things can bubble up. It's an emergent process as opposed to a very directed process.
Yeah. Well, so my counterpoint to that is, I think facilitation is a really broad word. And for like maybe the last year and a half, I've been involved in men's work. I should be in my men's group tonight. It's Tuesday. I'm here at Control the Room in Austin instead. And that is a very different type of facilitation, right? For years, my facilitation operating system was based on design thinking, which was hyper time boxed, moving forward, energizers, thinking based, very visual, right? And going from small groups to large groups, really large groups. My men's group is about slowing down. Way, way down. There's no writing. I mean, not that there can't be. It's verbal, and it's somatic. It's body based. It's facilitation, but we're not. It would look pretty alien. And so when I teach my facilitation masterclass, what I want people to have is range, because facilitating a group dialogue with like 20 people and trying to like get 20 people to like get to a shared perspective can be done with a very, very strong facilitator, with strong presence, with strong active listening skills, with strong threading and connecting skills. But it is a lot of work. And dividing and conquering is another way of facilitating, which we do all the time in design thinking workshops, where you push things out to the edges, where you do a lot of paired and solo thinking and small group thinking, and only let certain things bubble up to the top level. And they're both facilitation. But for one person, they would look at this other type and be like, that's not, like, that's hard, or that's not effective, or that's not connecting people to their humanity, or you're like, oh, that takes too long. People could look at tastes great, less filling of facilitation, but there's so many different ways to be a facilitator. And I don't want to tell people that there's a way to be a facilitator. I want people to discover their own way to be a facilitator.
Yeah, I think it's many times, like I went to school at Parsons for a degree in strategic design and management. And one of the things that we went through was there are 9 different schools of thought around strategy. And that many of these firms will say, okay, this is the BCG way of doing strategy, and this is the only way we're going to do it. And I just came to realize that it's good to understand all of those schools of thought. It's good to understand different ways of employing design thinking and consider them as part of your toolbox, and to find different ways that you're able to work those tools and those methodologies in your own way. and so that you're free to exercise, sometimes even your personality in the way you conduct some of those conversations.
Yes, and I think the fundamental truth is everyone has to discover their own way. And do you get to your own way from discovering everyone else's, or do you get to your own way from thinking fundamentally? Again, as a physicist person, I'm like, think deeply, look deeply. One of the things I was actually looking around the office for a card deck I just designed, but I just gave a deck of them to Douglas. I've been doing this exercise in my facilitation masterclass for the last couple of years, where I get people to generate their, what I would call their facilitation hats. Mm-hmm. What roles do you take on as a facilitator? What roles do you have to take on and off? Mm-hmm. What roles are hard for you to put on? What roles are hard for you to take off? And we get people to generate those and just do some mapping with them. And in some of my individual coaching clients, what I've found is that it gets them to be able to be introspective about what's easy for them and what's hard for them. And if you can name and notice something, you can invoke it. If you can say, like, I want to become I want to be a better MC. You can study MCing, right? If you say, like, I want to become more fun, or I want to be a better explainer, or a better teacher, or a better nourisher, a better detective, a wizard, more artistic. These are all literal hats of facilitation. I've collected hundreds of these hats, and I just made a deck of 52 because I thought it would be fun to do. And it's actually like, it's very similar to, have you ever done any inner family systems or inner voice work? So this is a thread of therapy that I do some of with my therapist, where you think about, like, when you're having inner conflict, you're like, oh God, I'm so upset with myself, or like, I wish I could do blank better, or I can't believe I blanked. The question is, well, what is that voice saying to you? And what's the other side of you saying? And let's identify those two voices, and let's take that conversation that they're having and make it explicit rather than implicit, instead of it being fast and abusive. And I don't think I'm the only person who has inner voices that beat the crap out of me all the time. Slowing that conversation down, taking it outside of your head and putting it in the room or on the wall allows you to have a conversation with yourself. And the other day, I asked somebody how they were using the cards, and they were going to use it to hand out roles to people. Like, here, you be this part of facilitation, you be this. Everybody's a facilitator in the room. I used it for, okay, how do I want to show up today? I picked out 3 cards. It was fun, nourisher, and detective. And I was like, that's fascinating. That is totally what I'm going to be in this meeting that I'm going to go into right now. It sparked joy in me to be like, okay, I can pull that out of myself, right? That's how I want to show up today. Why not?
I think that's fascinating. I think there's so much. I'd be interested to take a look at that as well, because I think there's different scales that exercise could be done at, right? There's within oneself, between 2 people, within a team, within an organization. How can a leader take the approach of designing conversations as a way to change the way they work, or even just looking at culture in general of a team or organization?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is just taking a step back and saying, I'd like to design it, already puts you in the perspective of thinking about the ends and the means, and then who's involved. And when you talk about strategy and design, that is just the fundamental thing. Where are we now? Where do I want it to go? Where might it go? And what's the gap? Who's involved? You map that out, and you can have a very interesting conversation with yourself. Ask the other person the exact same questions. Ask yourself and ask them, and you're on even footing and saying, well, I'd like it to go this way, and I can see you'd like it to go that way. People are afraid. I'm afraid sometimes to ask a question that I don't want to hear the answer to. Yeah. But it takes a certain type of courage to be able to say, like, it's better to know than to not know. Yeah. And so that's having the conversation. That, like, I think the first line of the book, which I should know, is our lives are defined by the conversations we can and can't have. And if you literally can't have the conversation, then it won't happen, right? If you can have the conversation, it might happen. And so I think for leaders, it's the same thing with the facilitators hats. I've used the exact same exercise in the Innovation Leadership Accelerator that I host, where we just say like, okay, what are your leadership hats? Get clear as possible about what you want to invoke, what your brand of leadership is. Although I don't like using the word brand with leadership.
But it's understandable.
But with culture, it's the same thing. You're absolutely right. Culture is a conversation. It's just like a conglomeration of conversations. And with culture is a conversation where it's not necessarily clear who's quote unquote leading the conversation. But conversations have components. Like I've come to the conclusion that you can design a conversation and there are components of a conversation that are designable. Some are easy to see, some are hard to see, some are slippery, some are very sticky. The conversation operating system that's on my website, I can send you a link to it. I tried to figure out, and threading is one of them, but every conversation has a place. Now our conversation is happening in the air right now. Right. And the interface between us is all the technology between us. When you're having an in-person conversation versus a conversation, if we were doing this at a whiteboard together, we'd be having a very, very different conversation. That's why the folks from Mural are so interesting to me, because they create a conversation that creates a broadband connection between people. And so always ask, is where the conversation is happening supporting or not supporting the conversation you want to have? When you talk about culture, just look at your space. What does the space say about your culture?
You're speaking my love language. I mean, that was from my world in architecture, where we considered ourselves spatial storytellers. Yeah. That your physical environment can either, one, embody your culture, or it could serve as a reshaping device.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% true. Space is space and place. The interface for the conversation either supports it or degrades it. Now, here's the thing, what's that famous MIT building that was just like a shitty ramshackle building where all the coolest inventions of the 60s is building 31 or whatever it was. I can't remember.
I don't remember. I should know as an architecture guy.
But the whole point of this is the classic thing of affordances in an architecture are either it's can be over designed or under designed. And in this case, it was under designed in a very positive way because people were knocking out walls and moving furniture around and connecting things. It allowed them to sort of feel like anything goes, as opposed to a hyper designed WeWork space, which supports a certain type of interaction and feels a certain way, but certainly doesn't make you feel like you can be Tony Stark and go into hardware mode and synthesize a new element and just all right, just let's shoot some lasers around the place. You can see that my references are mostly action movies.
Which I'm glad that you're referencing Marvel and not the other crew.
Although I did just see The Joker on the plane, and it was
The Joker was
interesting.
Good. Very good.
Pretty intense.
Yeah, it was very good. What led you to start the design or the Conversation Design Factory?
Well, so the Conversation Factory is a pun for me. When I started in 2015, I left the Design Gym, which is a company I co-founded in New York, and I went and traveled a bit, and I was consulting with a group called Second Road in Australia through a friend of mine, Justin Connor. He was a wonderful, wonderful man and an amazing facilitator. And he and I had this amazing conversation, and he was like, your approach is way too mechanical. You should come out here. We'll bring you on some projects and we'll break you. That wasn't his term. He didn't say that, but he was like, I think you'd enjoy our approach. And what they called their facilitation practice, conversation design. And when I first heard that term, I was repelled, not attracted, because as a designer, designers are very petulant and possessive lot. Any designers listening, prove me wrong. I think we work against it in ourselves sometimes, but we design because we like to control, we like to make. And even though I've been teaching design thinking to non-designers since 2010, I because I thought teaching design thinking to non-designers was a good idea, because if we could all speak the language of design thinking, we could all collaborate together. What a great idea. And I still think it's a great idea. But at the end of the day, design and design thinking are different. And so when these non-designers were saying, well, we're conversation designers, and I was like, what does that even mean? But it was really an interesting perspective, and it really cracked open my head. And in my progression from industrial design to user experience design to when experience design and service design became ascendant, I was like, well, and this was even before voice was even really a thing. I mean, 2015, I guess voice design was on the rise, but it wasn't in my consciousness. And so when I heard conversation design, I wasn't thinking of conversational design or human computer conversation design. I was thinking it in the terms that they were talking about it as human systems conversation design. We design the conversation that an organization is having about a problem they're having. We design the conversation a team is having so that they can change the direction of their business. And I was like, that's so weird. And I remember it just was a bug in my brain. And I did 4 interviews. I thought maybe I would start a podcast. This was January of 2016. And I interviewed Dave Gray, who wrote Game Storming with Sonny Brown and James McAnufo, and Abby Covert, who wrote How to Make Sense of Any Mess, 2 really good friends and amazing friend mentors to me. And Philip McKenzie, who now has his own podcast. He's like a culture consultant, and my friend Leland Mashmeyer, who at the time was with the Collins Group and is now the chief creative officer at Chobani. He's a badass. And I just I don't know, I picked those 4 people and I was like, okay, I want to just do a conversation with you. And I was like, when I say the word conversation design, you say go. And they were like, they just sort of riffed on it. And they were like, it's interesting, it's weird, it's confronting, it's strange. All the things. Well, let's talk about manipulation and control. Let's talk about negotiation versus communication, systems thinking, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, it's just interesting. But I didn't do anything about it until 2017. I think I just sat on it. But the Conversation Factory was first just a little holding company for my budding facilitation business, because in 2016 I left the design gym and I was traveling and I needed a container for the conversation, and I thought like, well, conversation is interesting, but it was a slow burn for me. And so 2017 I started the podcast, and really with the proposition of trying to understand what a conversation was made of. If we could design it, and if we could design it, what were we designing? Just like straight up investigation. I hoped that maybe I'd be able to write a book towards the middle of it. Not that I'm Tim Ferriss, but like Tools of Titans. I was like, oh, come on. That's just a bunch of podcast interviews in a really good book form. Tim, if you're listening, I love you. Please come on my show. I'd love to have a conversation with Tim. Tim's a very interesting conversation designer.
Absolutely. I mean, his podcasts, the free flow, the ebb and flow, the vulnerability of those conversations. I love listening to that podcast.
Yeah, and he goes between fixed questions and fluid questions. And anyway, it's fascinating. And he's evolved as an interviewer because he's gotten better at it. And I'll tell you, you'll see this in your podcast. The worst thing in the world is to be able to look at a graph of your conversations, because that's when you look at the audio file, I was like, oh God, I'm not a good enough listener. I can see when I was trying to break in on them and ask a follow-up question, and you can see the conversation, and it changes. Once you can see it, it's different. And that's what, if we're going to go back to culture, if you can't, how do you even perceive the culture? How do you even diagram it? And that's why people make canvases. You're like, okay, let's talk about the purpose and the goals and the vision and the blah, 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 and whatever. In my book, I have a section where I talk about the culture of a community. And I use the conversation operating system, the 9 elements of the conversation operating system canvas, to diagram a community. Because if you can diagram a one-on-one conversation, they're all if a community, an organization, a team, they're made of conversations. You can diagram any conversation. And I did it with Ladies Get Paid, which is a community I'm a huge fan of. Claire Wasserman came on my show 3 years ago now, and her community, Ladies Get Paid, exists to how to say this? Eliminate the pay gap between men and women. It's an amazing invitation. And basically anybody can be part of the community if they want to, because they got sued by men's rights activists for like not letting women into their events, which is terrible. I mean, on our podcast, we actually brainstormed ways that she could integrate men into the community in a safe and interesting and valuable way. And you can diagram that conversation. You can brainstorm conversation approaches, but in the present, you just have to sort of, you go with your gut, and your gut is based on what you were taught, and then the question is like, what do you do with your gut reactions?
Well, we've referenced a lot of aspects, bits and pieces of your book. So let's talk specifically about your book. Your book is Good Talk, How to Design Conversations That Matter.
True story.
What led you to write the book outside of being a compilation of a podcast, which I know it's not?
It's not. So there's the cynical answer and then there's the real answer. The cynical answer is like, you will write a book one day, because if you want to play the thought leadership game, like it's, the book is the new business card, whatever. But I think my dad's library was full of books, not surprisingly. And what else is a library full of? Magazines. I think a book was something that I aspired to. I don't think I knew that, but creating new knowledge from science was interesting to me. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wrote a book. The other is because, like, as a business person, like having a book is a way to put a sound out there. One of the other components of a conversation is the invitation, right? What starts a conversation off? Is it a push or is it a pull? Is it a poke or is it a shove or is it an outstretched hand? Right? These are all ways and a facilitator has to be great at framing invitations. How might we versus how must we? How should we? How will we? Right? Problem framing is fundamentally invitation design, right?
Yeah,
not just for weddings anymore.
And I think I've heard you say that before, but I think the invitation aspect of it is tremendously important, especially when we've had historically the design of our organizations has been hierarchical, yes. This top-down command and control. And whenever any initiative is being launched, it is basically people are being pushed or being directed yes. to do something. And so even if a company is going to adopt design thinking, it could be this top-down approach, and I don't think it'll gain traction. But if they are invited to yes. experiment and be part of it, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about too, is how a leader needs to transition from being an architect of culture to a facilitator of culture, which always includes an invitation.
Yes, but is it a real invitation or is it a bullshit invitation? Because these things do not exist in a vacuum. Right? People remember past abuses and the scars exist. And so when you say, hey, let's come to this new initiative, people are like, oh God, I remember that other initiative and nothing happened with it. Fool me once, fool me twice. Right? That's something that leaders also have to come into contact with. You should really listen to, I interviewed Bree Groff on my show. She spoke at the Sprint conference that Google hosted last year, and she talks about the 6 stages of grief in organizational change, and she has a wonderful, wonderful framework. And she talks about how, if you think about the arc of change, leaders want to start at the, hey, we've got a new change and now we manage the change, but we don't start at the very beginning where everyone else is, which is grieving at the loss of what was, yeah. And also acknowledging what was.
Well, I think even in some cases, there is a grieving at the leadership level. The leadership level, in that many times any change requires probably just as much change for the leader, because they're having to to lead in a different way. And I think, I think of it sometimes in generational aspects where if we're going to lead our companies into a new era, that means we need to change the way we lead to become more vulnerable, a little bit more courageous, and be more of a facilitator, which invites the possibility that they may not be the one to lead, the company to the next chapter.
Yeah. Conversational leadership is a different type of leadership. You could call it facilitative leadership, potentially. Conversational leadership for me is more of a question than an answer. Like, I don't know exactly what it is. We can probably, it's like pornography or art. We know what it isn't when we know it when we see it. I don't know if you know that old joke. This is like,
I hadn't heard that one before.
It's like a judge trying to like adjudicate whether or not something was profane or not. And he's like, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Here's the thing. I think leaders, and this is Bree's point, Bree says that leaders who gather together and make a decision, or a leader who makes a decision themselves, has already processed a lot of that grief. They've worked through it with their coach or with their board or whatever. And then there's this desire to share something perfect with other people. And ta-da, here, okay, let's launch day, cut the ribbon, get it started. But everyone else needs to go through the exact same process that they did. And so this is what we teach in design thinking over and over again, which is empathy, right? Empathy. It's not just for customers, right? What does it mean to actually try and perspective take and think about what somebody else is experiencing? Can you go to the balcony? A term that my friend Bob Bordone uses. Like I'm quoting people. This is like where I learn things on my podcast. This is where I learn things. Bob, who taught the Harvard Negotiation Institute workshop that I went to, a week-long intellectual vacation in negotiation. Highly recommend taking a break from everything you normally do and hanging out with a bunch of lawyers and mediators and learning how to like negotiate better. His term was just going to the balcony. Can you go to the balcony and say, what does this look like from the outside? Would somebody looking at this deal being done see it as legitimate? Would somebody else looking at this from the outside look at these criteria that you're using and say, yeah, this looks good? And often we try to like slide something through or get something done. And you're like, am I acting in such a way as I would want to the whole world to see this? Am I acting in a way that I would want someone else to do? Right? The golden rule. So it's like empathy applied really consistently and broadly. I'm not going to say it can solve problems, but it's certainly a useful tool. And so that I don't know, how did we get here? Oh my God.
No, this is deeply philosophical, but I think it goes to the inner journey of leaders that are embarking on this journey of change. And I think these are important things to talk about, especially the grieving. When we say that, when a leader presents a new way of doing things, they in some ways have already processed their own grieving to this new way of doing things. I think that's important because I think they've already had an inner conversation, and now they need to design the outer conversation. And so that was one of the things that I realized in the book, as I was writing the book, was that if this is a conversation and I can have a conversation with myself and a team is having a conversation, that's when I started to say like, oh, wow, organizations are conversations. Not just that they're like a sum of conversations. It itself is like it ebbs and flows. You can go into a company and you're like, this place is humming. You can feel the energy just the way you can feel the energy in the room in a workshop. And so I think an organization or a culture is a conversation. Culture is a conversation that anybody can participate in, right? A real culture. Have you ever, I remember going into a small town in Sweden when I was in grad school. We did there was a summer program in Copenhagen. I blew glass for a summer. It was an awesome summer. And then we went to Sweden and Finland to like study other, Scandinavian glassblowing styles. So we went to this little small town and there was like a bunch of,
guys with like super slicked back and slicked up hair wearing like leather jackets, and they all had hot rods. And I was like, why am I walking into the 50s? What is happening here? This was like 2005. And apparently there's like a real like 50s muscle car Americana enthusiasts in Sweden. And it's like, that never died, or it came back. That culture is something you can always participate in. Have you ever seen the movie Ghost Dog? Oh, dude. I mean, it's about like Forrest Whitaker, who's amazing, playing a man who is living by the samurai Bushido code, even though he's like an assassin for like a local mob. How did he decide to enter into authentically? Like, you could call it culture theft or whatever. He's just like totally legit in himself with the samurai sword and like living the culture. He's like, this is the way I live my life. A real culture, I think, cultures have a very broad invitation. Like, you can be a punk rocker with just a safety pin and a leather jacket, right? And enough hair gel. Nobody can tell you you're not punk. I mean, punks can tell you you're not punk. But then you'd be like, screw you, you're a poser. And so I think culture like that is the invitation to a culture can be so broad. Anybody can enter into that conversation if they want to. If you want to like live your life like Leonardo da Vinci, if you want to relive the Renaissance and be a Renaissance man, you can be a Renaissance man. I first got this, anybody who's listening to this, James Carson's book, Finite and Infinite Games, was the first clue I had about this, that culture is a game. And anybody can play it if they want to, right? You just have to make the rules clear and invite people into it. And often you go into a company, the rules aren't clear.
Yeah. And I think, you know, like I can think of an example of a design firm that reached out to me. They asked me to help facilitate some conversations around, you know, co-creating the culture for their firm. But I really pushed back and said, well, before I do that at sort of a macro scale within the company, I need to have that conversation with your leadership team. Because what I don't want to do is open up an opportunity to have a conversation at a macro scale that hasn't been had at the leadership level. Right. Because that, you're right, there needs to be courage, there's vulnerability, humility to have that conversation at an executive level. So that they could, in a sense, embody the type of conversation that they are wanting their teams to have. Yeah. And I think that idea of facilitation or these workshops being, whether they're structured or unstructured conversations, it's still a conversation.
They are. And, you know, you could say we're having a conversation all the time. Is the leader showing up? How are they showing up? Right. We get these signs and signals all the time. Is FaceTime required? Is somebody staying late all the time? Like, is somebody coming early all the time? We figure out what's kind of expected of us, that it looks bad. If we leave early, it's frowned upon. We figure these things out. And one of the best examples I can think of this is, and I try to demonstrate this in my own facilitation, is leading by example. Leaders like to read articles about how to give people feedback. You know, what's the best way to give somebody feedback? Because somebody's really screwing up and I want to tell them how badly they're screwing up, but I want to do it in a way that they hear it and fix it, but I don't have to fire them because that's really expensive. Is there an article on HBR that I can read about that? And the answer is yes, there is. But they're not asking for feedback. Right? So it's not a two-way conversation. And they wait until things are really bad to do the feedback, right? And the one-on-ones that they're having, I remember somebody who I was coaching and they were like, my leader keeps pushing off our one-on-ones. We're supposed to be having these one-on-ones and they get rescheduled all the time. Like, what does that signal to you? Right? That's sending a message. Absolutely. If we're sending a message, we're having a conversation. And so if they're not having in that one-on-one, they're like, so what do you need? Right? Tell me what's going on with you. And they're not saying like, hey, so what do you need from me? What am I not giving from you? What are you seeing in me? If it's not a 50-50 conversation, what they're saying is this is a one-way street.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Conversations definitely are two-way dialogues. And I think as opposed to just one person saying something, I think that's so important. What are some other things? We've covered a lot about conversations. What are some other things that we haven't discussed that are in your book that people can learn?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about the idea that conversations have size, right? So whether it's with me or with us or a big us, or between us and them, like conversations have size. And I think we've also talked about this idea that conversations have structure, right? I think that's like section 3 and section 4. We're just like covering everything. I think the thing that is hardest for me is making time for the conversation with myself. And if I had a gift to give to the world and to myself, it would be the gift of time, right? The ability to be reflective and to review and re-examine. All the best philosophers, thinkers, strategists will tell you, Bill Gates takes his reading retreats, right? Ben Franklin had his morning and evening reflections. What good will I do today? What good have I done today? Allison Coward, who I had on my podcast, who's a wonderful facilitator and a wonderful person, has a weekly Sunday date with herself where she just does an hour of reflection. And she does a Friday morning reading because she's like, my work is my brain. And so I need to give my brain food. And I got to be honest with you, I starved myself. Yeah. Right. And so the last chapter of the book is You Are a Conversation. And my brother, who is a very, very hard to please customer, said that was his favorite chapter. He said that was the best chapter of the book. And I was like, does that mean the rest of them sucked? I don't know. But this idea that you're a conversation and that we can learn from ourselves, that we can examine the different parts of our lives. And I'm sure you've done this in an innovation workshop where IDEO teaches this. I used to teach this at Design Gym. Let's go out into the world and see how other people are solving this problem. In Jake Knapp's book, Design Sprint, they talk about lightning talks. Like, how else is this problem being solved? Like, what does this look like in other industries? And let's steal ideas from other places. That's horizontal. It's called horizontal evolution. It happens all the time where we steal bits and pieces of DNA from other organisms. Our mitochondria inside of us is an entirely other organism with its own DNA that we ate millions of years ago. True story. We're aliens. We're we're symbiotes ourselves today. And so this idea that we can have a symbiotic relationship with our own life. And I've started to ask this of myself. Intimacy with my fiance and feeling welcomed and loved is really easy. Doing that with my clients is a lot harder. And so in the last couple of years, I've asked myself, how can I be more relational instead of transactional with my clients? Which is a really hard question because it's I have to, trust that money's just going to rain from the sky, or just love the hell out of them and trust that something will evolve out of it, because caring about them as humans and relating to them as humans is important. It's not an easy thing to do because it's exhausting, the amount of presence that we do as part of this job. And so that's something that's in the book as well, is that the conversation with yourself isn't just having better inner dialogue. It's absorbing and listening and letting your inner conversations have conversations, letting the conversations in your life talk to each other and say, how can the love that I have with my significant other, how can I take that lesson and bring it outward into my life? Similarly, one of the guys I coached in design thinking, I'm sure you've seen this happen. He's like, I used the active listening skills you taught us in the research thing with my wife, and it works, just like you said, Daniel. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, and I used that prioritization matrix. And boy, oh boy, is she so happy that we had the prioritization conversation about the to-do list. That was really great. I haven't been able to use it at work yet, And I'm like, I'm sure your client, your boss that's paying for this coaching is really happy that you have a happier home life. I would love for you to also use it on your sales calls, pretty please. But that's what I mean about your conversations, having conversations where we use the tools from one place to another. These skills we have at work, people are doing Kanban at home now, right? People are using Kanban for their kids, for their chores to do doing and done, right? You're having weekly stand-ups. People have weekly stand-ups with their wives now, right? And some people are like, that's ridiculous. That's like over-designing the conversation, right? And my mother will say, I don't want to design the conversation all the time, Daniel. And I'm like, Mom, that's a design decision. Under-designing it is a choice. And so that to me is like things that people should realize is that you are already designing your conversations.
Yeah, my dad used to say, not making a decision is a decision to not make a decision.
Yep, your dad's wise. It's true. It is a decision.
Absolutely fantastic stuff.
Dad's always smart.
We've been talking to Daniel Stillman, a conversation designer and podcaster at The Conversation Factory and author of the book, Good Talk, How to Design Conversations That Matter. Daniel, if people want to learn more about you, where can they go?
Pretty straightforward. They can go to The Conversation Factory. It's a long URL, but it's all English words, so it's easy to spell. No consonants missing, no weird vowels missing, just theconversationfactory.com. And if they want to go to the book, it's on Amazon and they can pre-order it. It might be on sale by the time this comes out. And if they want to download some free chapters and some worksheets, they can go to theconversationfactory.com/goodtalk, or they can follow the link on the website.
All right, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the conversation.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Culture Design Show. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review of the podcast.